Going live. Okay. What? So, can people hear us?
Yes, hi.
Hi. How are you guys? Sorry we were late. We had some technical difficulties, and so we will get started. My name is Rachel. I am one of the career advisors here at Udacity. I'm joined by Sala, who heads up our student support team. And we're broadcasting from my laptop, so I'm very sorry. We thought we were going to have a bigger projector, so I'm sorry that it's just our faces. Okay, so we can do a quick introduction of the people joining, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And if you guys could mute yourselves, that would help cut down on any potential feedback we have. And if at the end you want to ask questions, we can make time to do so. Okay. So, I think most people have joined by now, so I'll introduce myself again. I'm Rachel. I'm the organizer of this event. I appreciate you taking the time to join us for this webcast on all things visa support and work authorization. Again, just a disclaimer, this is not going to be a legally based discussion in terms of legal support. This is more a personal discussion of personal experiences and one person's journey through navigating work authorization. So I have a few questions that Saul and I are going to be discussing. I did go through everybody who submitted questions, and I pulled a few for us to make sure we touched on. And then if at the end we have time, we'll definitely open up the floor and give people the opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully we can discuss them as best we can. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me find my questions. Right there. So Salwa, do you want to introduce yourself just a little bit while we get started?
Sure. So to kind of give the premise behind this webcast too, I thought it would be beneficial to talk about both my personal experience and professional experience and how I kind of came into the world of navigating the work authorizations for the past decade or more. So I came to the U.S. as an international student back in 2002. And I got my bachelor's degree from Wellesley College, and after that, I worked at a biomedical research institute in Boston, went back to graduate school. You can kind of see where my visa or work authorizations came into play, going from the and then I got my graduate degree, a master's in technology and additional education from Harvard University at their education school, and then started my career at Wellesley College as a program director for international internships, where one of my primary roles was actually advising international students who are looking for jobs in the US, as well as students here who are looking to pursue international careers. But today we're going to primarily focus on international students looking for jobs in the US, not so much the part, which I believe there were some folks who were interested in that. And then from there, I came into the US, I came to Udacity, and I've been working here as the VP of Student Services here. And one of the things we do is we do have a lot of students who are international students and who are interested in looking for jobs here, so we kind of are going to split up our discussion today into, there's the part where you're looking for a job and your job search, and there's the part about the work authorization and what kind of authorizations you're eligible for. And some of the latter can actually inform how you go about your job search. So that's something that I think Rachel and I will talk about. I know personally I've done that quite a bit for myself in terms of figuring out what my options are and then also making choices around that. And one thing, as Rachel mentioned, this is not a legal session. At the same time, each student or candidate's situation is very unique. So I can mostly talk from my perspective in helping my students at Wellesley or helping my family navigate the system, which some of it will resonate with a lot of you. But at the same time, there's so many factors. It depends on your citizenship, where you were born, sometimes depending on the immigration status or the job application status that you're applying for, your marital status or age. Like there's a lot of different factors that can come into it. We'll be able to touch upon a few of those.
Yeah. And we'll also be sure to follow up with you all, everybody who attended and those who signed up but weren't able to make it, with not only a link to view this for additional, maybe you were trying to take notes, you weren't able to get all of it, but also like as much of a resource base as we can provide you in terms of external resources. So outside of Udacity, different types of sites to go to, try to find the most out of your job search, because as Saul mentioned, each person's situation is going to be very unique to them, and we can't therefore advise on what's going to work for everybody. So instead, we'll try to at least provide you with the resources to get the most out of your own search. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Sawa. And I know that you shared a little bit about some of your background and what brought you here to Udacity, but maybe if you could kind of go into a little bit more detail about what your own personal experience was, maybe specifically some obstacles you faced in your own job search.
So my situation was unique. So when I came to the U.S. as an international student, I came from Bangladesh, although I was actually born and raised in South Arabia. So you can already kind of see like where you're born is not necessarily where your citizenship is, unlike here in the U.S. where that's a rule. So that's something that definitely played a factor into the kind of jobs I pursued or what I looked at. So at the time that I was graduating from college, I obviously applied for OPT, which is the optional practical training, and that's about 12 months of work authorization to work in the U.S., and you're getting practical training to a field that's related to your major. We're going to request folks to
please mute yourself. You're getting feedback.
At the time, also, I had a unique situation where my family was in the process of immigrating to the U.S. Not me. I had actually aged out of that system. So I had to pursue my own thing. So in terms of looking at my options, I knew that I wanted to stay in the U.S. in order to be able to be close to my family. To the extent that's possible, but I didn't necessarily have the choice of going back home because there wasn't a home when I started moving. So there were some restrictions I had to think about. So when I got my first position, which was the OPT for 12 months working at this biomedical research institute, soon after that I also kind of got advice around, okay, if I want to be close to them, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. This was probably the time for me to think about that. If I weren't thinking about graduate school at all, I would have taken a very different path. But because I considered that, I went into graduate school right away. And OPT is something you receive right after every degree. You get 12 months of it after your bachelor's, you get another 12 months of it after your master's, you get another 12 months of it after your PhD or advanced degrees. So that's kind of how I stacked it. And as you can see, it was very deliberate on my part, knowing that I wanted to get a graduate degree and kind of maximizing the time. At the time, I was 21, had just graduated, and I wanted to make sure that I was still in the US when my family was figuring this out, and then I would go back later. To Bangladesh if need be. They wanted to make those assessments right away. OPT is one thing that I want to make clear is related with STEM fields, which is in technology and math. You actually get a much longer period of OPT than you do with your regular, with any other major. And the way it's connected is your major. So if you majored in math, you would get 17 months on top of your 12 months. And I believe recently there was a ruling this May where it's actually 24 months. So that's something you wanna be aware of. Are we using this mic or the mic on your computer?
We're using this mic.
Okay.
It's connected. So we try.
We can try that. I can see like a lot of you are having issues hearing me, so I'm gonna try.
We're gonna switch mics for a second. So if we cut out, that's why. 1 second.
Okay, so we'll look out for comments to see if this makes it any better. I know my voice doesn't project a lot either.
Does this help a little bit? Okay.
All right. Okay, so I'm gonna stick with this and I'm gonna try to project. It
Thank you.
like most people like this mic better. All right, so as I was saying, that when I went from one to the other OPT, now one thing to kind of look out for is, and this was something that was a surprise to me, like I got my master's degree in technology and education, so in my head I was thinking, oh, it's tech, I should get that STEM extension.
Okay.
Funnily enough, it was a master's in education, so it didn't count. It had to be, your major had to be in a tech field, so you had to have like a math major or an engineering major. I fell under the education category, even though my program was tech. So just something to research. So what I basically want people to kind of think about is you will hear a lot about these like OPT extensions, cap extensions, all these terms like thrown around, and you really want to do your own research. Like I said, like every single case is so unique. Like my case was different from my sister's, primarily because it was just a difference in like age, and I had aged out. I was over 21, she wasn't. So there are all these factors, and you also want to be wary of like looking at forums or kind of generic topics, because when it comes to filling out forms and everything, there's really one authoritative website. It's the USCIS, which is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Information System, and they have all of the forms, and they kind of house a lot of different things. So they come under the Department of Homeland Security. It's them. There's ICE. There's a bunch of different units that you want to be aware of. And then in terms of also researching, like I think at the time, and I understand it's probably the case for a lot of people, it would be best if you go to an immigration lawyer to talk through your options, but I know it wasn't an option for me. I couldn't financially afford it at the time. What I was able to do was, there are pro bono groups in different areas that will do this sort of work, or they will do it for, like, I think I went to this was in Boston, so forgive me if I remember this correctly. I want to say it was an Irish group or the Catholic Charities or somebody who did this, and it was like a $25 charge that I could do. So kind of seeking out these pro bono groups, if you're really stuck, is worth it. But most of the research I did was definitely on my own and talking to people and figuring out what my options are and being really good at reading these websites, official websites, and understanding your options. From that to OPT, and then once like both of my OPTs were done, that's when I came into the H-1B options, trying to think about, do I go into a work authorization or a work visa? Do I apply for it? What happens? Now, an H-1B is kind of the broader, which I think most candidates fall into, that you can apply for a job. Again, there are some restrictions there where the job has to require some specialized degrees. A lot of times, what that entails is requiring a bachelor's degree in the field. It's not the only case, but a lot of times that's what it is. So that meant I had to know, given that I had a bachelor's degree, I was able to look at jobs that required bachelor's degrees. And that's what I would apply to.
And so we get a lot of questions about H-1B from our students. And one of the things people have been asking is if their bachelor's degree, which essentially helped them get to the H-1B status, differs from the career path they're now trying to go through by taking Udacity courses, how is that impacted?
So there's a really nice FAQ section on the USCIS website about that. It's not the only way, it's the ideal way, because they don't want to see that you're in a field that's specialized and you have the qualifications for it. So I'm not going to like aim to be an expert or give legal advice around this, but there's definitely room there to justify it. And again, like I said, it doesn't have to be a bachelor's degree, but it has to be equivalent to show you that that's the case. And the norm generally is the bachelor's degree in that field. But like, disclaimer, I had a bachelor's degree in psychology and education. Granted, I mostly pursued education, but education is a fairly vague field when it comes to like teaching in the classroom versus online education. So there are ways to like kind of show that. And before this, I was in a biomedical research institute, but I was mostly doing writing for an education program. So that worked out too. Now, H-1Bs have a lottery system right now because there's a limited number that are offered every year. There are 65,000 that are offered in the general population. And with advanced degrees, masters or above, there's another 20,000. So and the applications are generally due on April 1st. Whenever the agency receives more applications than that, they will sometimes go through a lottery system. And it hasn't always been the case. I think when I first graduated from college, there were a couple of years when there wasn't a lottery. They just waited until those seats were filled up. In more recent years, there have been. So it's hard to tell. It totally depends on how many applications are coming in. That being said, H-1B also has two different categories. There's the exempt and non-exempt. So one of the categories has that 65,000 cap, the other one doesn't. So I did my research and realized I did not want to go into a lottery. And so I didn't want to take my chances. You may be braver. There are tons of people who do go through it and they're okay with it. And so there is a category where if you're affiliated with a university or a research institute affiliated with the university, you can get something that's outside of this cap, which is why I kind of limited my job search to university. And so I stuck to that because I did not want to go into the lottery. It's not as cut and dry because there are a lot of universities will not offer H-1Bs or will offer H-1Bs only to certain categories like faculty and research positions. Others will not. So again, do your research, figure out which companies do it. There's some really great resources that'll actually, this is public
information, like which companies sponsor H-1Bs is public information. And I have a favorite website that I was telling Rachel about called Going Global that links to one of these. It's not the only site that publishes it, it just links to it. But if you're able to look up who has sponsored H-1Bs this past year, that'll give you a sense of companies that are already aware of it, employers who are already aware of it, so that you don't have to re-educate them about that process.
Yes. Have you, just from personal experience, since this has been something you've gone through, have you found that companies are more likely to work with H-1B candidates if they are exempt or non-exempt? Is there some sort of a differentiation between the two? Or
I think what almost all companies are looking for are the right talent.
Okay.
So the fields that have kind of gaps or more jobs, they're more willing to go through that. This is probably why we see in tech, like at least in Silicon Valley, I've seen a lot more companies sponsoring than I did when I was in Boston or on the East Coast, just because it's a field that has a lot of jobs. So they're looking for the best talent, whether it's in the US or abroad, and they're willing to sponsor H-1Bs that way. Universities, even though they're exempt from this, don't necessarily always do this because they want to reserve their kind of time and energy for more faculty positions, which are harder to get qualified people for, rather than just any staff position. I was lucky and I was able to get one in a staff position, but during my search, I also identified which universities were not doing that and basically took them out of my job search.
I have another question. I have I've lost it. Okay, well that's good to know. And then in terms of in terms of resources for finding companies, resources like Going Global, I know that we've done a lot of look into. Another question that I get a lot from just students I work with is whether it's easier to start the sponsorship process if you're already in the U.S. or if you're internationally based. Right. I know that kind of fits a demographic for a lot of our students across the board. People who are not currently based in the U.S., I guess. What would that do? And if this isn't something that you personally experienced, we don't have to get into it.
So I think the location part relates more to your job search rather than the work authorization application. So even when I joined Udacity and just being out in California, I remember like a lot of people had advised me to just come out here because once you're here, it's more easier to connect with people. Informational interviews are a great way to make those first intros into companies and jobs. And so that helps. Being in the same physical space just helps you get the job. So it's less about the authorization. So I would say for international students, if you're abroad, the harder part is lining up that interview and doing it rather than thinking I'm at a disadvantage because I'm away. If you're at a disadvantage, it's with getting the job. It's less about the authorization.
Okay, that's a good point to make. And so you had mentioned going through holding an F1 or student visa, and then OPT, and then H-1B. So for you, what came after H-1B, and what was that process bridging that gap like?
So I had an H-1B for 3 years, and then I went through a renewal process because you can renew it for another 3 years, so that would be 6. I also had a pending immigration application, so that eventually came through for me. I lucked out.
Okay.
So I'm currently a permanent resident. If I were not, I probably would have figured out what the next steps from H-1B would have been, and probably would have looked into what employment-based immigration would have looked like. That was an option for me because I already had a standing family-based immigration. I didn't pursue that.
Okay. Yeah. So that's where personal situations can come into play pretty heavily.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are a lot of other options besides H-1B.
Yeah.
Like there's the O visa for extraordinary ability, depending on your citizenship, like I was mentioning. There's TN visas. I know there's special visas for people from Singapore, from Canada, from Mexico, which I know less about because I didn't go through them. But there are a lot of different ways. And another thing I'll mention between F1 and H-1B that I think is critical for students or candidates to remember is intent behind visas matter. So you apply for a visa, as many of you probably know about this process. You eventually go to an embassy, a counselor looks at your application, and they approve or don't approve it. One thing to keep in mind is an F1, and this was my intent coming into the US. Of course, circumstances changed and I stayed, but I don't think that was my intent coming in. So on an F1 student visa, you're really here to study. You do your practical training and then you go back. So that's something they really do look for, is your intent is not to immigrate, your intent is H-1B, that's a dual intent visa. Okay. So once you're in an H-1B, if you do have intent to immigrate, that's okay, but you can go in either category. But having intent to immigrate on an F1 is pretty much grounds for not getting an F1. So that's something to kind of keep a lookout for. Is H-1B and then you decide to pursue this is fine because it's a dual intent.
Okay, that makes sense. So I know that you briefly touched on it a little bit, and in terms of your experience at Wellesley, where you personally advised and worked with international students on how to make the most of an impending career search or job search, and how to you advise them on how to navigate, similarly to what you're doing now. For those students, was there any major issues that they faced that you think our students could benefit hearing from, or any resources that you were able to provide? We touched on going global, and I know that was a main one then too, but anything else that would
Sure, there are a couple there. Yeah, so I worked out of the career office, so I primarily helped them with their job search. There was a separate international students office, which I benefited from greatly. So they would bring in speakers, including immigration lawyers and folks to advise them on it. So we really worked together. That was also that group that helped them with the OPT applications or anything else that came in between maintaining status. So it was nice that I didn't have to do any of that part. I mostly advised students on their job search. One thing that's critical for international students is timelines. So on top of your job search timeline, you're also looking at your application for work authorization timeline. So there's two different worlds, and you almost have to keep the two together. So being aware of H-1B applications go in April. They don't actually go into effect until October. Being aware of that. Being aware of when your OPT application needs to go in and how long it takes. It takes, I think, up to 3 months, and then being aware of how long you can actually be unemployed in an OPT. I think those have changed over time, so I'm not going to quote the number of days. I know it's varied between when I got my first OPT, that wasn't a restriction. It later became 60 days or 90 days, and it changes, so that's something we'll have to keep current on. And like I mentioned, since I haven't done this for the past 2 years or so, my information isn't as current, but the places to research is just as valuable. And then, so that kind of timeline is really important to be aware of. There are, of course, ways to get around it. If you have an OPT, it expires, and you have an H-1B that comes into effect a few months later, there's something called a cap gap extension that can kind of take you over. Didn't exist in my time, so there are things have definitely improved. At the same time, there's other restrictions. There are different periods when you can't travel. Your visa is separate from your status. So a visa allows you to come into the U.S. or basically travel. Your status tells you whether you're legal or not. And that's an important distinction I often want to make, is you may be on a legal status without a visa. That basically doesn't mean you're legal, but you don't have the permissions to travel, and you may have to go about securing that differently. And I've gone through that myself. There was a period of 5 years when I didn't risk it and did not travel just because of the kinds of visas I'd have to secure, or I was advised, I took recommendations. Even if I were able to, there are different things that kind of play into whether it's worth taking that risk or not. At the same time, always maintaining legal status is, of course, very, very important. So that's separate from the visa part of it.
That makes sense. And know that there's been, just historically, I think, with everybody involved in the process, there seems to be a lot of confusion regarding regulations of work authorization and visa, I think because of the two differences, and I think they kind of do get confused a lot. And I know that this is nothing that a personal or a company is choosing to do. It's all because of federal government regulations, and seems to be the cause of a lot of the concern or the confusion, I guess. And you've done a good job so far, I think, of breaking down the differences of it all. But is there for students who are still looking for clarification, you've mentioned the Going Global and the other website.
The USCIS website.
Is there any other resources our students should make available to themselves while trying to navigate this?
Right. So I just noticed recently that the Department of Homeland Security has a Studying in the U.S. initiative, and it has a lot of really good information on there too. This was very new. I was just researching myself this morning and realized that that's actually available. So going off of official websites, it's fairly important. Another thing I found helpful, just because of the nuances, so I kind of mentioned actually seeking out legal advice to the extent that you can afford, but also talking to people that have gone through similar experiences. I know I do that kind of informally with my former students or people that I know, and then trying to tie them in, all the while knowing, like with that caveat, that it's not the same exact thing, but what are the different factors I have to consider is one way to go about it. So trying out the more informational interviews that you're able to pursue, both not just for your job search, but also for your work authorization applications are important. And then another thing I actually kind of thought about as we were talking about this is a common question my students used to have is when to disclose their their intent,
definitely.
Right? And there's no right or wrong answer to it. So I can share what my personal strategy has been, which people might find useful, and I'm sure there are people who have different strategies. Like I said, no right or wrong answer. Two very common questions. Now, what's also in our favor is you can't discriminate based on nationality. So people can't actually ask you that question legally on their job application, so they never do. Two questions they are allowed to ask is whether you have legal authorization or not. So if you're not currently in an OPT or an H-1B and you don't have legal authorization, then you kind of have to say no. However, if you are in an OPT, you can say yes, it's legally authorized, right? You don't have to say for how long. They're not asking you for how long. Another trick question that's often thrown into the job application is whether you will require sponsorship or not.
Yes.
So if you're, I'm a permanent resident now, so I don't need a sponsorship anymore. When I was on an H-1B, I did require sponsorship, so I had to say yes to that too. So you have to disclose it to the extent, like the minimal amount of information. Now, I never led my job application or interviews with I need a visa sponsorship. Do you do that? And then continue this conversation, because that's almost the initial grounds. Like as an employer and having been on the other side of interviewing candidates, once you get to know a candidate, once you know you really want them, you will go through the extra mile of trying to match their pay, trying to match their bonuses, help them out with relocation, help them out with visa application, just falls into that same bucket, right? When you don't know anything about a candidate and there's 100 different candidates, any kind of implication, whether it's anything from I don't think I can start work for the next month, or I'm located somewhere differently, like you see that as, oh, that's another step I'm going to have to do. So you want to establish yourself as a worthwhile candidate and then argue your cases from there. So personally, I don't disclose that right off the bat. As it gets close, though, like once you're kind of in several rounds of it and you think you're getting close to that, you're also not trying to hide information from employers. So you don't want to put them through extra work versus yourself. Because I can also see if I don't disclose it and then you're towards the end and it turns out you can't start, it's a waste of your time, it's a waste of employers' time. So you don't want to disclose it. But it's finding that fine balance between employers deciding you're worth it, and you also deciding, okay, this is the time to like make sure I'm upfront and honest about the procedure.
It is a very fine line, and usually when I'm talking with students and doing support sessions is you never want to like lead with a red flag. You never want to give a company cause for second guessing their interest in you. So I think that's a very good point. And so one question, I guess, that we get a lot also, is there from your experience, is there a certain profile of company who does tend to be more receptive to, just in general, to supporting visa candidates that come in with visa needs? In terms of company size, is there a certain type of industry?
So one thing to watch out for is it gets tricky over there too. So there is something called an H-1B dependent category for companies. So if a certain population, a certain percentage of your employee base has H-1Bs, then the company becomes H-1B dependent. And they have to follow all these different rules and regulations. And it's essentially to ensure that they're publicizing their jobs correctly in the US and US candidates have just as fair a chance. So what companies sometimes will do, and this can vary from company to company, they will sometimes try to not get into that category and have to follow all these other rules. So they will often save their quota for, like I was saying, like if you save it for your faculty, if you're a university, it's so that you don't enter that category. There are larger companies or tech companies that are more bullish and say, you know what, we're going to be in this category regardless. We're just going to apply and see how it works. So it really does vary. So a few years ago when I was still in the recruiting world and kind of doing this, is what I noticed is finance and tech are two groups that are pretty open about this, and they're also larger sized. So I almost always start with which companies applied for H-1Bs last year. And they will also show you how many H-1Bs they got. So if it's a large number, that means they're totally willing to apply for that many.
Gotcha.
Smaller companies are often hesitant, of course, because there are some costs involved, there are legal fees involved. Costs also, I want to kind of debunk the myth here. It's not that high. It really isn't. I think we have this impression like it's thousands of dollars.
Yes, I think
but a lot of it is actually the legal fees rather than what it actually requires to file. There are guidelines on what the employer pays for, and there's very little that the candidate can minimally pay for. So if you want to expedite it, that's the candidate can pay for that because you're almost like doing that on purpose, but there's a lot that the employer needs to pay for. But yeah, so that being said, there's some advantage to smaller companies too, though, is if you have very small populations and you're really paying attention to every single employee, there's more you can actually talk them through. So for example, if you know the founder or the CEO or someone high up that you're talking to, and it's a 5-person company, chances of you convincing them or helping them through the paperwork is easier than a large company that the hiring manager will look at it, not necessarily understand it and say, you know what, go to HR, and they have a policy they stick to, and they'll say no and you're out. So again, kind of a fine balance. So it's a no means to say, oh, this type of company is better than the other, but there are a couple of factors to consider.
That's good to know, because I think it sounds like a common misconception is that startups, for example, are like off the books. Like you can't, if you need visa support, don't try to get with a startup because there's no way they can support it. I think that just from conversations I've had, that tends to be something that people just automatically assume. So it's good. That's a good insight.
My sister is a 5-person startup. They have sponsored H-1Bs. Granted, we come through a history of this, so we're kind of
you're sympathetic to it.
Yes,
I think that makes a big difference too, is being able to, I think, appropriately educate. If the person who you're talking to at the company is not already aware, being able to help educate them on what the process actually is like, because I think there's a stigma or a assumption on both sides of it. Okay. So that was really helpful. One other thing I wanted to ask, and we touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of college degrees, but there is a notion of, if you're going to be here on a student visa or a secure student visa, you need to be part of an accredited university and receive an accredited degree. And a question I get a lot is if Udacity's nano degree is substantial enough to stand in as an accredited degree. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, we're not a university. We're offering degree paths, but we're not an accredited institution, and therefore you can't necessarily secure H-1B or F1 status by also taking a Udacity.
I would have to research that myself. So, I mean, when I had it, it was definitely for a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree. So I don't know that for sure. But if it says accredited degree, then you would have to follow that path. There's also like different types of visas, even for studying. So there's a J1, there's an exchange. But as the name kind of implies, it's generally for a fixed period of time, whether it's 1 or 2 years, and there are stipulations around whether you have to go back to your country. So F1 isn't the only student visa, but so we would have to, like, if it says accredited, then nano degrees don't count, and that's what we have to look out for, but I can't say for certain that that's a requirement.
That makes sense. I get a lot of questions about accreditation and all that fun stuff. Okay, and so then a few other things I think we wanted to make sure we covered were just certain, like, so the STEM extension, we covered that a little bit already.
We covered that a little bit, and like I was kind of saying, that those rules changed quite a bit. So it went from, like, in the few years that I've been here, from nothing special for STEM students to an additional 17 months, and now it's like 24 months. So definitely always keep up to date, and this is as recent as May of this year. And definitely keep up to date, look at the research, and make sure, like, you're aware of what your options are, because they may be changing.
And then also, just because Udacity just recently launched their Nano Degree Plus program, where we offer a certain level of career placement support. One of the reasons behind having this webcast in general is because we've been getting a lot of questions regarding what types of work authorization and visa we can support through this program, and even location. So we have a lot of our students who are part of all of our Nano Degrees that are based all over the world, not just in in the US and are looking for all sorts of different types of employment, US based, non-US based, etc. And so I guess I just wanted to take the time right now before we start getting into student questions about what the difference is between our standard nanodegree path and our nanodegree path that comes with the jobs guarantee, and to make sure that there's clarification as to what we mean by being able to support you in a placement. And so the main difference is that nanodegree plus comes with job placement support at the end for 6 months, with the idea that if you aren't placed within 6 months, we would help with a refund if you hold up to your end of the deal in terms of adhering to the terms we set out. One of those terms is being able to legally work within the U.S. And so having a level, one of the visa support or visa options that we've already talked about in our talk today. So one of the student visas, OPT, H-1B, etc.
Right. And kind of to clarify, like Udacity is mainly serving as somebody with providing career support and doing that matchmaking between the employer and the candidate. A work visa or authorization is really between the employer and the employee. So Udacity doesn't actually have a role.
Yes.
Here.
And one of the reasons as to why we've had to clarify what we're able to support is only because of like federal law regulations and what the federal government allows for. Obviously, it's not a personal preference on our end. It's not us saying that some people are more worthy of jobs than others. It has nothing to do with that. It's us needing to adhere to what companies are actually able to hire. Let's see here. And then one thing also that I think has been a big question is because of the fact that we do service so many internationally based students, there have been so many cultural differences that play a part in an application process, or even as far as like a formatting of a resume. And so is there any support, or could you shed any light on what that experience was like?
So this kind of goes back to when we try not to disclose certain information that can be used as basis for differentiating between candidates. So the same way, like I wouldn't necessarily disclose what my work authorization is or nationality is, I wouldn't want them to guess based on my application, right?
Yes.
So there's a whole reason behind why we don't put age on there or gender on there, or other like our photographs on our resumes, right? So one thing I've noticed across from living in different countries, and Going Global is a pretty good resource for this as well, is resumes or CVs are interpreted differently in different cultures. So for example, in Bangladesh, we did used to at one point add our photographs or information like address, age, all and that's generally one easy way of being able to tell if a candidate is international or not, and you don't necessarily want to give it away that way.
Yeah. That's a great point, and I think it goes both ways for people who are trying to get a job in the U.S. and also people who are trying to get a job. I know of a couple people, when they submitted their questions, mentioned wanting to look for work in the UK or Europe. Each country individually will probably have different ways of like a best practice for structuring their resume. So it might do you some benefit to look into seeing what popular resources are available there, because everybody will have a different way of formatting it, just to make sure that.
And this is where I think the job search, like putting on my career advisor hat too, is trying to do those informational interviews, not with just folks from that particular company, but even within the industry. So whether it's connections that you're reaching out to, and as you have more of those conversations, you're able to kind of identify how you have to structure that job application to get the best out of it. And similar to interview preparation as well, is the types of interviews vary vastly from like behavioral questions in one industry to having to do like teaching demos in another, like in the education industry, to doing technical interviews in another. So the more you kind of like talk to folks and are able to get that information, the better prepared you will be.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and so now I'm going to pull from some questions that people have included when they signed up for this webcast. There were a lot of questions we were not able to go into detail on because it was outside of our ability to answer due to the legal nature of the questions. So if your question specifically isn't covered in this, I do apologize. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will be following up with you guys with resources to help guide you in the right direction if it is if what you're looking for is outside of our purview and what we're able to cover. So don't be too put off yet if we aren't able to really get into what you're hoping for. And so yeah, let's see here. So one person had asked, and I think this resonates with some of what we talked about today, is they are working currently as a programmer in Japan, and they have a BS degree in mathematics, but not in computer science. Does this person possibly need a master's in computer science to get hired, or do you think, from your experiences, is mathematics similarly, it's part of the STEM?
So the question doesn't say to get hired into what role, right?
That's
so just
true.
says to get hired, so definitely varies. But at the same time, in my experience, your degree and your particular major doesn't have to be that specific.
Okay.
A lot of times, like what employers are really looking for is that your skill set matches what the job entails.
Yep.
And so if you're able, even if it's a job entirely based on programming and your degree may be in math, but you're already a programmer, so you've demonstrated that anyway. So that's one way of looking at it. It can also work the other way. So I remember, like, one of my career advisors used to tell me is you have to look at work experience and academic experience and try to get a merger. So it's not so much like, oh, if I get 1 credit here because of my academic experience and get 2 credits here because of my professional experience, that makes up 3. It can go the other way around too. And these are just arbitrary numbers to kind of show you that one can balance the other. Because academic training is also time spent in learning just as much as like professional your professional time is time spent in learning in a certain field. And math and computer science are so closely related. What you're essentially getting out of it is the ability to do logical thinking and be able to apply that. And then also being able to like really learn quickly on the job. I don't think there's any academic degree that prepares you, unless it's a vocational degree for a specific company, that tells you exactly what your day in and day out is going to be like. So you have to be able to learn on the job, and that's what people are looking for. Even in an interview, the ability to learn quickly on the job matters way more than these are the particular math concepts I learned in school versus I'm going to learn on the job.
So then, and I know that this my next question, I think, fits a lot of people who come to Udacity, regardless of where they're located. If you don't have a typically traditional background in terms of education or even prior work experience, how could you make the most of a job search with that? Like, what is your recommendation? I know what I usually recommend to the people I talk to, but
no, for sure. And I think this is the basis of how nano degrees have been created, is being able to demonstrate that you've done the job or you can do the job. So having a portfolio of projects that show that, and similarly in your interview or in your cover letter on your resume, kind of displaying that. Like, there's no one right way of writing a resume basically for this reason. Otherwise, we'd have a template right? So if your strengths are particularly matching up to what you did in your academic experience, then that's what you put up front. But if it's your professional experience, that's the detail you go into. And sometimes it's not even either one of those. It could be a personal project you took on, a volunteer opportunity. It could be something like a class project I worked on with classmates, but really relates to the work world. So it could be a combination of these things. And even some of the visa stuff that we talked about when I was doing my research recently, I know like bachelor's degree is the standard, but almost every single time that has been mentioned, it's been qualified with or equivalent experience or training that demonstrate the same thing. So that's something to keep in mind. It's always about, like, you have to understand from the employer point of view what they're trying to get at, and then you fit yourself into that world and say, okay, if this is what they're looking for, and if I really do know how to do it, how do I demonstrate that? Is it my degrees, or is it the fact that I've actually built these projects, or is it how I express myself in my cover letter interview?
So then a follow-up question to that would be, how could somebody go about building up the equivalent work experience? I know that we try our best to be able to, with the projects we have as part of our nano degree, to be able to give them real-world, tangible project experience. But in addition to that, that's not always going to be enough for some people. So what would be a good way for somebody based not in the US to continue to build work experience to then be equivalent to start applying for jobs?
So almost taking a step back in the job search, right? Like one of the things I used to tell my students is when you're researching, there are a couple of different things to consider. It's not just the industry that's broadly, but then also thinking about what type of organization. Do I like a small organization? Do I like a bigger one? There's pros and cons to both. And then similarly, like location might matter. You may want to live in a particular part of the world. In this case, like we're talking about the US, but which part might play a factor in here. And then kind of as you're researching these, you will come up with a portfolio of companies that you think are your dream role. So I like the approach of this is my ideal job, which I'm sure years later I might decide is not my ideal job, but you have that in mind and then you find out companies in that realm that you would get to. So even thinking about your job search in terms of it's not just the job, there's that company and then there's the role. So for example, for a long time, I really, really cared about Sesame Street and I wanted to work there. So kind of thinking about it is at an entry level, do you just look for any entry level within that organization to work yourself up to that?
Okay.
Or do you look for the right role? So if I want to be an accountant, do I want to be an accountant in a company that practices that or an accountant in a school district, for example, right? So you have to think of that combination of role versus organization. Once you get your foot in the door, you can work towards the other one. And then going back to kind of your question around how you do that is once you have this list of companies and you look at a list of their job opportunities, and this is really like treat that as your research or learning. It's almost like your coursework to figure that out, is what are those jobs looking for? And what do the people in those companies do? So even looking at their LinkedIn profiles of the candidates that look at those, that work there, and what do their profiles say? And that'll give you an idea of like what kind of work you have to build up to. And then seeking out those opportunities. It can be completely freelance, like you can be taking up projects, whether they're volunteer, maybe it's an internship, but building up to that, because another key thing that people look for is being able to work in a group or collaborate. So finding things that are within that realm. Like if I were to look for an education opportunity, the first thing I would probably do is volunteer at the closest school that'll take me. So kind of like building that up. And then also making sure like it's not something, I'm not going to find something that's way too far out there that I can't even get to, but starting to build that up locally and using that first stepping stone for the next one. So kind of showing this like continued experience or interest and then persistence is something that really does really fun.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I also think that it's helpful in general to have to really hone in on something specifically that you're interested in. There's this popular thought that if you're not able to get a job, just keep educating yourself so that way you can do everything. And I think that there needs to be a fine balance between actual real life experience and an education experience. So taking the time to really invest in learning in developing what you learned is very beneficial to an overall job search. And then from your experience, do companies, there seems to be this thought that you need to have an Ivy League education if you're going to also be somebody who's dealing with needing a visa with companies.
No, I don't think I've ever seen Ivy League as a requirement or that being the necessary part. I mean, companies that are going through that extra work want to make sure that they have a candidate that can do the work. And if that doesn't necessarily come from a degree or a brand name, or rather it's more you can actually
educate. The name of your university does not always carry the amount of weight I think people think it does. Okay.
We're also getting to the list of
We are. So let's do maybe one more question, and I think then we will tie it all up. And so I actually think we covered most of the questions that I had in just our terms of the talk. Let's see. There was one more I wanted to make sure we covered. Let me try to find it. So this one person actually asked in, and I think this is a great way to kind of tie up our talk, is what are some of the best, we've mentioned them, but I think it would be good to kind of retouch on them a little bit. What are some of the good resources, links, and references outside of Udacity? So within Udacity, we have our Career Resources Center, which I know we have some links to resources for international students. But outside of Udacity, what are some other resources that people should be looking into. We talked about going global, which we will be. We're trying to build a partnership with them. So as a student, I would highly recommend you checking them out. And hopefully we can start to be able to provide additional information from them. But anything else?
One thing I found useful is there's a lot of information out there for resumes, LinkedIn, and all of that. And there's a career center at every university that has a lot of public information out there. There's generally like little career or job offices by communities too that have public information. So I tend to look at those. That's been very helpful for myself. There's a lot of like interview guides, whether it's anything from like looking at a site like Stack Overflow to very generic ones to more specific ones for that sort of information is definitely helpful. And then I can't stress, and then also there are groups. So kind of finding like special interest groups. So when I first started out, I would look at little groups within LinkedIn and then join them because there would be conversation there. Some are more active than others, but if there's a specific type of job I'm looking for, I would join that LinkedIn group. Similarly, there are professional organizations. So like if you're a fundraising professional, there's everything from like an association for fundraising professionals. So if you're interested in web dev, there are groups like that. So joining those groups and kind of getting that insight is helpful. There are a lot of like, they will put up conferences and such, but they will also put up like publications related to that. They're both helpful in terms of jobs as well as whether it's work authorization type of information. And then the more you look, the better you are equipped in terms of kind of taking the noise out of it. Because there's a lot of forums that will discuss things that don't pertain to you, are outdated. So being aware of that is very important as well. And then, so for me, it's been really like these international student groups at universities as well as their career offices and doing that. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing informational interviews with actual folks at companies and being able to get, and folks have been in these scenarios. And it takes a lot of effort. Like it's not going to be the first connection you make. It's going to be a second degree, third degree, and you kind of have to keep at it. And if you set yourself a goal in terms of, okay, this is how many people I'm going to talk to, and this is how many job applications I'm going to send out, chances are there'll be 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10 that'll work out, but that's the one you need, and you have to do the work for the rest of it before you get to that one golden one.
I think the point you made just now in that answer about making sure that the research you're doing is like targeted research and not getting caught up in all of the other noise that's out there. The internet and Google is a great resource, but also can be very intimidating and can also sometimes lead people astray and provide them the wrong information. So being careful to get resources from credible sites versus just anybody talking about their situation on a blog. So being careful to kind of tread through that also.
Like when it comes to visas, I go straight to the embassy sites. Of course, there's all sorts of aggregate sites that are out there, and I can sometimes use them as a shortcut to get to it, but always verify against the official, whether it's the government side or the state side or the embassy side.
If somebody was living abroad and wanted to figure out how to come over to the U.S., would visiting their local embassy be a good place to start, at least for information collecting, or should they go somewhere else?
So the embassy would be the U.S. embassy in that country, right? So you would be applying through USCIS and the forms, and then when you eventually get the visa stamp, it's an interview for the U.S. embassy. So it's the embassy of the country that you're trying to go to. And on the flip side, if you're trying to get someone a service to go back to your own country, then it's also like your citizenship is tied to the embassy that will serve you. But if you're trying to like get to a country, then it's the embassy of that country that you have to get to.
That makes sense. So I know that people were including a few questions while we were talking, and I apologize that we're not going to be able to get to those today. However, I'll be going through them at the end of this call, and we will do our best to follow up with you guys based on the question that you proposed. If it's not covered by the general resources we'll be sending out at the end. And then if there's any other specific questions that you have about this that you'd like to make sure we see or somebody here at Udacity recognizes, emailing the career-support@udacity.com is a great way to get a hold of us. And you can just tag Webcast follow-up, and we'll be sure to keep an eye out on it, and I'll follow up with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
And I'm glad like my experiences hopefully will come in handy for some folks. And my goal really here was to direct you into like, if there's one word I can leave everyone with, it's research.
Yes.
There's really no shortcut to that. It's just so much information and being handy. And there are people out there to help, like I said, like there are legal institutions and definitely folks who are willing to help with that. I know I try my best as much as possible. So getting the information together and being equipped, showing your employer that you're kind of, resourceful is something that will go a long way when it comes to job search.
And we are here to support you as much as we can. Obviously, we are bound by certain things that we can't talk about or can't advise on, but we'll do our best. So we look forward to connecting with you guys, and thank you for dealing with our technical issues at the beginning of it. So we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Bye.